first. All right, we're recording. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Med Mentor Mondays. We have an awesome panel today, and the topic of this week is going to be reapplying to medical school. So we love a great comeback story, and we're going to hear some awesome stories today. So why don't I just have the panelists introduce themselves first? Emily, you want to start off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily. I'm originally from Minnesota. I went to Emory University for undergrad, and I took 2 years off. I actually did 2 different masters. If anybody has questions about years off and what you can do in your time between undergrad and med school. Then I came to med school. I'm actually completely done with all of my medical school curriculum, and I'm headed towards graduation. But in my time here, I helped 3 different people reapply to medical school, and I feel like I've got some few tips and tricks that I kind of learned along the way that might be helpful to y'all.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gurji. I'm from Central California, and I went to UCLA for undergrad. I took 4 years off between undergrad and med school, so I did a few different things. I'm happy to share the different activities I was involved in to help strengthen my application the second time around. And I specifically did a post-bac program too, so I can share some insight on that as well.
And my name is Austin. I'm from Sacramento, California, but I went to school in Minnesota actually. And I took 3 years off in between undergrad and medical school and reapplied during that time too. So happy to answer any questions about that.
Yeah, so thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. Just some housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions about the topic of today's panel, please ask them through the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat. We'll reserve the chat for any general things like, oh, hey, Zoom's not working or something like that, technical difficulties. But if you have questions about reapplying to medical school or anything like that, please put them into the Q&A. All righty, so let's go ahead and get started. So this week we're talking about reapplying, and that means, applying multiple cycles. So why don't we first talk about, what your approach to reapplication was? What were your thoughts after, submitting your first application and then, going into your second application?
I can start out on this one. So the first time around I applied was during my second gap year. And I applied pretty broadly, to 20 or 22 schools. And being a California native, I applied to some California schools, but kind of all over the place. And then I got one interview and was on the wait list at the school I interviewed at. And then it was coming to March, and I was kind of an all or nothing situation. So I kind of had to hedge my bets and kind of expect to not get in so that I wouldn't have to wait a full another year before applying again. And I basically just kind of took a hard look at the numbers, like MCAT score and GPA, and just said, maybe I can improve. So I kind of doubled down, studied again, took the MCAT again, and then did much better on the MCAT the second time, which helped. And then because of that, I think I could just narrow my focus a little bit. And also during that year of having applied, I really, tried to beef up my extracurriculars. I worked at a cardiology clinic in Boston during my gap years. So I tried to really get some meaningful research done. I worked another job also to pay for reapplying again. So I tried to really make the most of that extra year that I had to apply again. And I think, taking that time and really leaning into it as opposed to just kind of hoping things worked out, I think was the what put me over the line and helped me get into UCLA at the end of the day.
For me, I also like had applied for the first time during my second gap year, but it was definitely like a rushed application cycle for me. Long story short, I had like some family stuff come up, so I wasn't originally planning on applying that cycle, but I had to move back home. And because I wasn't like really doing anything, I decided just to like go for it. And that was definitely like the biggest mistake. And at that time, I didn't realize like timing and preparation were key, especially because like I had no mentors in medicine at that time. Like I'm first gen, so I had no idea what I was doing, but I didn't know that I didn't know all the stuff at that point. So like I took the MCAT, like I think it was like late October. I didn't submit my application till almost like close to like the deadline of the primary MCAT. So it was like really rushed. But I did get secondaries and I did get an interview. And I was rejected, but I think it was like towards April. So I hadn't really thought about reapplying until close to like April and May. And that's when I realized like I couldn't just like reapply that next cycle because I had no idea what I was doing. So I started looking for post-bac programs at that time. And I specifically wanted to look for programs that were targeted towards like reapplicants because I figured that might be more tailored for like what I needed. So that's when I applied to like the UCLA reapplication program. And so I did that for a year and I was able to connect with mentors. I was able to like figure out how to retake the MCAT and like just like critically evaluate my application and figure out what were like strengths and weaknesses. And so I decided to take 2 years before I reapplied because I just learned that I needed a little bit more clinical experiences. So I started working as a scribe. I also worked in an ophthalmology clinic at the front desk and stuff. And then I volunteered at like Venice Family Clinics. I did a bunch of different stuff to help like my clinical side. And then I was able to reapply successfully like the year after I'd completed my post-bac program.
Kind of in a similar vein to both of the stories, everybody that I've helped successfully reapply, I think kind of the time taken off and the things that people will do depends on areas of potential concern that you might have had with the first application the first time around. Varying amounts of time in between. And I think it kind of depends. One of the people I helped is really concerned about their MCAT score. And in comparison to something like GPA or clinical experience, I think MCAT score is a little bit faster to turn around just because you kind of set your own study schedule and you could set, the date that you take the test. But there's other strategies that you might want to pursue if you feel like you might not have the same level of clinical experience as some of the other applicants, and some of those things just take time to kind of get integrated into. I think scribing, as been mentioned, is really great. Gets you in the clinical environment, gets you practicing some of the things that you do in medical school, but at the same time you don't want to apply 2 weeks after you start doing that. You want to apply giving it some lead time so that you have it to talk about in your application as something that you've done and pursued successfully.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, everyone. I imagine that, waiting for interviews and results and, maybe not getting the results that you want can be a very challenging time for you, especially since you're pouring so much energy and money into med school applications. So how did you deal with rejection and how did you take care of your own, personal well-being and mental health?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and something that I think almost counterintuitively should be like prioritized ahead of the work and the application related processes, because only when you're confident that you can do it despite the rejections of the previous cycle, that the work starts to like take care of itself. So the ways I really tried to prioritize that were to come up with another project that was just totally unrelated to medicine or any application stuff, anything like that. And to really lean into that, because it helped kind of distract me, because honestly the hardest part of the application cycle is waiting. It's so long. You start your MCAT probably a year before any of your interviews or more even, and then you submit everything, wait a while, submit some more stuff, wait again, and then the interviews can come at really any time. There were some I got a month ahead, like I got notice a month ahead, some a week notice. So you kind of have to just be ready all the time. But the other thing I would say is having a really strong support network, and really leaning on them as much as possible, and carving out activities to do together. Because the other part of the application cycle that I didn't really realize until after I really reflected on it is how much alone time it requires. So, studying for the MCAT, writing all the essays, and doing everything, traveling to the interviews you do alone most of the time. So having, carved out time to do things with your friends or family, it really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I just would echo what Austin said, like making sure you have a great support system. Like I think initially when I realized I had to reapply, I just spent a lot of time with my family, just like talking to them and just explaining like what my thought process was, and then just like figuring out how they could best support me, because it was just like it was a really difficult conversation to have too. And then once I figured out like, okay, this is what I want to do, like I want to do a post-bac program and stuff, I feel like I was really lucky because like I was in a small cohort with people and there was like only five of us total. So like I was in a group of like with a group of people who were going through the same process in the sense that they were reapplying. So I think it was really great to just be able to talk to them and just spend time, like even if we weren't studying for the MCAT together, like we would just meet up, grab some food and just like check in with each other. So I think it was just like, I think it's like helpful to find people who might be going through the same stuff, like even if they're not reapplying, like if they're just applying, taking the MCAT, it's because it's like hard to explain it to even family members or like, friends who aren't like trying to do med school and stuff. It's like they can be there, but it's like still difficult for them to fully understand. So I think trying to connect with people who are in the similar path, it was really helpful for me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sometimes, especially around this time of year, it can be difficult to continue friendships the way that they were beforehand, especially if one friend gets into medical school or the school that they were applying to, and another friend who also applied did not get in, and they're particularly upset about that. And of course, we always want to support everybody, but it's definitely okay to feel those emotions and let yourself experience those emotions as much as you need to. I think it's really helpful to have kind of like the buddy system going on, where even if you weren't like very close friends before now, and just kind of picking up where you left off, you can always be support structures for each other. And it's a lot easier because you don't need to explain like every little detail along the way, kind of as Gurjeet said. So it's always okay to try and like reach out to somebody that you might not be as familiar with or might not have had as close of a relationship with, that is going through the same thing, and kind of share your experiences.
Yeah, great advice from everyone. Did anyone ever kind of lose hope at all during this process? Like, did you ever stop and ask yourself like, oh, maybe I shouldn't apply to medical school? And what, if that did happen, like what got you over that hump? Because obviously we're all at medical school now, right? So, what was able to, other than like a fantastic support system and all of that, what really made you sit down and say, medicine is where I belong, so I have to reapply?
Yeah, I definitely had that like conversation with myself, like right after my first cycle. I like just sat down and I like was like, I knew like it was gonna take a lot of money, a lot of energy, and just like a lot of mental like fortitude to reapply. And I was like, is this something I really want to do? And so I just like reflected, like kind of what Austin was saying. Like I spent a lot of time by myself, just like thinking, like, what are my long-term goals? What do I want myself to be doing in 10 years? Like, is medicine like really going to help me get there? And I was like even going through other careers in like healthcare and seeing if they would fit with that. And like at the end of the day, I was like, it's only medical school that's like really going to get me to where I want to be. So it was just a lot of self-reflection, sitting down. And then I feel like once I was able to do that, then like the sense of like hopelessness was kind of gone because I'm like, this is what I want to do. And I was like, if I do something else, it's kind of like settling. And I knew at the end, like I wouldn't be happy. So I was like, I like want to give myself another chance at this because this is what like is going to make me the happiest. So
Yeah, it's very similar for me. I think, the long, like drawn out marathon of the process, it would seem weird to me that if you don't have that conversation, even if you get in the first time and like in the middle of waiting and to the applications, when you're getting started, it's like, can I really do this? And because you're not just signing up for the application process, you're signing up for 4 years of school, X amount of residency, and maybe a fellowship on top of that. So you're really committing and signing off a lot of time and energy and money, at least at the beginning, towards the effort of whatever type of doctor you want to be. And I think it would be, for my own reasoning was, if I could sign up for that the first time, I definitely could do it again, because for me, the main two reasons are, I just generally love to learn things. And I think medicine is something where you can never really stop learning. And on top of that, you get to do it in a way that is really meaningful and helpful to a lot of people. So similar to what Gurjeet said, it's what I think would have, or hopefully will make me the happiest at the end. And that's something I think worth working toward, because in the long run, 1 extra year of reapplying is, or even 2 extra years of reapplying is worth a 30-year career, So that was my thought process.
I echo very much the same thing. In all of my time off, I spent like volunteer time, shadowing time in the clinical setting. And it was not only like a good part of like staying busy and always staying active in various things, but I swear some of the like coolest feelings that you'll ever have is when you really get that opportunity to help a patient that you feel like you really made a difference in their life. And that instant feeling would always bring back the like, okay, this is the reason I'm studying for this MCAT. This is the reason why I'm working on all of these various projects and doing all of these extracurriculars. And my hope is that, at some point they don't just become, kind of bullet points on an application, but that they become something that you really internalize and then take on to your future medical school careers. And so I'd highly recommend doing clinical related things, whether it's volunteering, shadowing, scribing, anything in a clinical environment where you get to work with patients. And for those people who really do want to become part of the medical field, it's very easy to continue to want to do those great things and help others that way.
All right, so before we move on to the next topic, do the panelists have any final comments about this?
I can go first. I think if there's one thing I've learned in all of the reapplicants I've seen, it's like deadlines, deadlines, deadlines. And even for that, especially for medical school applications, most of them are kind of rolling in nature, but it always benefits you to get things in complete as early as possible. It can make a huge difference. And for those of you thinking like, maybe putting some stuff off into like later into the application cycle, I would definitely caution you on that and try to like push you to get it done earlier. because the whole rolling environment of like when applications are fully received and completed can just kind of like make or break a lot of cases, at least from what I was familiar with.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you, everyone. So next we're going to talk about how you prepared for the new cycle. So the first question I want to ask is, how did you evaluate your strengths and weaknesses from your first application? How did you what was the process of sitting down and saying, oh, maybe I need to retake the MCAT, or maybe I need to take or do a post-bac? Like, how did you evaluate the pros and cons of your application?
I can start off. So I think for me, I kind of already mentioned it. Like I kind of just like reflected and I was like, I really don't know much about how to apply to med school. So I figured the post-bac was the best route for me, because it would provide me with structure and like mentors and just resources that I didn't have access to. And so then through the post-bac program, I was able to like go through my entire AMCAS like with a mentor and like individually go through every section. And because I decided that I was going to take like 2 years off before reapplying, I figured like I had enough time to retake the MCAT and also take some more classes for my GPA. So it was more of like, and I was planning on working during my gap year, so I would have like the financial means to be able to like take more classes through like UCLA extension. And so like it was like more because I was planning on taking more time off. I figured I could just work on as many aspects of my application as I could. So that's how I decided what to do and like how to evaluate my application. And then I just talked to a bunch of different people. So I had people that were in different places of their career, like look at my application. So I had like MD, PhD students look at my application. I had like people that were in AdCom committees look at my application. I had just like practicing physicians and stuff. So I could get different advice, and then I synthesized it together to figure out like how to like best make my application a good representative of like myself, which I didn't realize was a big thing the first time around. So I think just like making sure like your application from your activities to your personal statement and to your letters of rec really like is cohesive in the sense that it represents who you are as a person and like gives out like whatever you want to communicate to the AdCom committee. So that's like how I was evaluating it, figuring out if like I needed to add more or like, and how it would like reflect who I am as a person.
Yeah, I think during my application cycles, I was fortunate to work in a clinic where there were doctors everywhere. The research mentor that I worked with most closely, I sat down and talked with him, and I think before any of the kind of objective metrics were addressed, we really sat down and talked about the things we've already touched on a little bit about, like, do you think you can do this? Do you really want to do this? And before any of that, before any of the application stuff, before we talked through it or read through any essays, we really nailed down like the motivation and values that drive my desire to reapply. Because I think that's like a solid foundation to build on, because it's going to take a lot of work, and it's only really worth it if you can really follow it through. So we did that. Then I think I started with just the general like numbers. So is my MCAT score strong enough? Is my GPA strong enough? And then kind of tried to fine tune those, and then moved on to the extracurriculars, activities, personal statement, and eventually the secondary essays. But once we figured out that, that I said, I only really had like 3 months or 2 months to do it all again. So kind of had to really form a plan and really stick to it. Having like a good solid plan where, like Emily said, you can meet all the deadlines, because they are really important, is really key. Not only for getting things done on time, but for kind of staying motivated and having like objective goals to meet as you're working your way through all the material. So I think number one, having a solid support network and mentor who could provide advice and read things over. And then number two, having a really like a solid foundation of, confidence and mental health to really do the whole thing again, are what I focused on.
Echo everything. The only thing I'd have to add to is kind of what Gurjeet alluded to, where I think one of the best ways to find those like potential areas of concern in a previous application is to get it in front of as many people as possible who know the application process, whether they're mentors, like your friends who were able to successfully get into medical school, family, friends who are happy to just like lend a hand when needed. But then always to remember that each person is going to have their own bias. And so the more people you get it in front of, the more usually like larger areas of concern or more common areas of concern usually come out. But if you've only gotten it in front of, one person, always take with a grain of salt what they might have to say, because you don't want to go spending your time pursuing something that most people probably wouldn't be concerned about. And that's the risk you run, only having like a couple pairs of eyes on it.
So I want to follow up on that. How different is it, or how important is it to have, say, your peers who are also applying look at your application versus people who have actually gone through and been successful through the process? Is it different at all?
It's a very good question. Oh, go ahead, Austin. I think it very much depends. Again, everyone comes with their own background of bias. And so just because one person gives you feedback doesn't mean that that's going to be the feedback that someone else might have for you, or the feedback that the person who eventually reads your application is going to have for your application. I think it's really important to remember too, whether somebody is like really supportive of you, and if they're not so supportive, they might not be the best person to ask for advice and kind of going through your application with you. And it's okay not to ask every single person that you know to give you feedback on it, especially if you feel like that feedback hasn't been constructive or helpful.
Yeah, similar. I think in my especially for the essays with editing and things, I was actually an English major in school. So I sent it to a few of my English major friends because they're actually much better at writing than a lot of the doctors or even my, kind of biology focused friends. So I tried to get a variety of perspectives. So, one with the English major, two with a doctor that I work for, and then three with another friend of mine who was also applying. So you kind of get multiple perspectives on things. That can lead to like, some people say, I love this sentence, and some people say, take the sentence out, and you're kind of, stuck for what to do. But at the end of the day, I think, take as much information as is useful, not necessarily as much as you can get, and then view that through your own lens of how does this represent who I am? Because I think all the people can do is help with the technical things like grammar, but at the end of the day, it's your voice and your representation of your qualifications. So use the information effectively, but also follow your instincts and what you think is best for you.
One last thing I'd want to add to all that would be, besides having people just look it over, I also found it helpful to actually read out like my essays and personal statements, just because like I would write it down and I thought it sounded one way, and then when I read it out loud, it was not the way I wanted it to come across. So I thought that was really helpful too. So I'd recommend just reading out loud. It might seem weird if like people are around you, but you can just read it out loud, like in your own room or something.
Yeah, so again, on a similar topic, how many I guess, was your essay similar to your first essay? or like was the second essay you ended up writing similar or different, or what parts of your application really changed over the reapplication period?
Okay, I can start off with this one. So most of my application was rechanged just because it was like really rushed the first time around. So I had like, I think like 2 of my letters of rec were still from like the same people, but I had gotten, I think 5 other ones from different people like throughout my 2 gap years after my application cycle, like from like one of the doctors I scribed with and just other experiences I had. In terms of my personal statement, it was completely changed because again, the first time I took like a week to write it, which I would not recommend at all. And I only had like one person look over it. So the second time around, I think I like started drafting my essay like 6 months in advance and I had multiple people look over it. So that's why it was completely different. And then my secondaries were also really different as well. But I think again, it was like really circumstance dependent because my entire first application was rushed and I felt like it wasn't the best representation of myself.
Yeah, similar to that. I think, I took into account a lot of the feedback I got and also the activities I had done in that year that I had taken during the application cycle and tried to emphasize like certain strengths. So the research job I had, and then the other job I had, the second job I had was coaching soccer. And I thought, okay, what can I do to, use this information in a way that helps me stand out? And some of the, secondary essays, I kept pretty similar, just because they were the answers I had given previously were the most relevant. And then some of them I totally rewrote. The personal statement I totally rewrote, because for the similar reasons I just mentioned about trying to emphasize things that I think helped. But the other part of that is, what you can do is just do as much work as possible to put them next to each other. So take your previous application and compare it to the one you think you're about to submit, and just see how it lines up. And you can, we always said in our English classes, like, just kind of be brutally honest with your essays. Like, does it sound good? Because the more edits you hold back, the more room for improvement there is. So if you really want to make it the best version as possible, just like be as critical as possible of the material and say, this aspect of my first application was really great. Maybe I can include it somehow in my second application. These aspects I can throw away. And most of the times, some people would say, like, if you have to ask if you should keep it in or leave it out, it's probably okay to leave it out. So that's what I would say.
Kind of going off of what Austin was talking about, I think a really good exercise if you're kind of struggling between the, do I keep my same personal statement or kind of write a whole new one, is I would just like try to put your old personal statement out of your mind, and then kind of in outline format, write down some of the major points you want to emphasize when you're applying for a second time around. That way you're not, writing a full essay or anything like that. But if you're coming up with very similar points that you had in your original personal statement, maybe that personal statement is a very good representation of, what you want to come across in your application, and you might end up keeping most of it. If you write down a lot of points, it's been a couple of years, you've done a lot of things since you first applied. Maybe it would be time to, start writing on those new points, and you're going to end up with a very different personal statement from when you first started. But I think kind of going back and thinking through it in outline format helps, because you don't spend a lot of time on it, but then you also realize, maybe there are some more points that I want to put in there, and it would be worth it to go back and do some rewriting or completely draft a whole new personal statement.
Yeah, 100%. That's the same exact advice I give to all of my students too. Just, really ask yourself, what is the key message you want your reader to know? And then when you write your essay, ask yourself, does my essay answer the question, like, did my reader get this message, or did I get this message across to my reader? So great advice. Just to quantify things a little bit more, because I'm sure our attendees, want a better idea of like what changed or what didn't. Like, I know Gurjeet had mentioned like some, or like her letters of recommendations had changed or had stayed the same, but like, were all of them the same for all of the panelists? Did some of them change? Like how much of your essays did you end up changing? I think our attendees kind of would be curious about that.
Yeah, I can go off of that a little bit. I think it very much depends on the time frame between when you first applied and then when you're applying again. Depending on, if you're applying the very next cycle, you might not have a lot of changes in like who you asked for letters. I think some letters that people send recurrently might come from like undergrad experiences, and you might not have seen that professor since then, but that professor still like thought very highly of you and is happy to recommend you again, kind of a thing. It might not be so important that you like go back and get a new letter. Maybe you can ask them to update it or something like that if you feel that it's very necessary. But then if you take a couple of years off and you work with a mentor for a couple of years on various projects and stuff like that, that would be somebody to definitely ask for a letter, especially if they've sat down with you and gone over your journey and know you very well. So kind of depends there. And then I think it kind of follows suit with similar patterning in all of your essays. It's kind of like time dependent, and the changes in comparison to your first application, what you're introducing in your next application, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think very similar for me. We just talked about the personal statement, but I rewrote a whole new one, and then I would say a few of the secondary essays were the same and a few were different. I'd say it's about 50-50. My undergrad letters of recommendation were the same because I had been out of school for 2 years at that point. But the one that did change was I added another letter of recommendation from one of the doctors I did research for in that time, because we had worked together much more in that year that had gone by during the application cycle, the first application cycle. So we had gotten to know each other really well and done a couple projects together. And I think that helped. But the other thing that changed, my GPA was the same, but the MCAT score, like I mentioned earlier, I retook it and did much better the second time. So I think that helped also.
Yeah, for me, I mentioned, I think almost everything changed in my application except for like the 2 letters of rec from my science professors in undergrad. It's like my GPA changed, my MCAT, I retook that. I added additional letters of rec from like the new activities I'd been doing during my 2 years, like after reapplying. And then my personal statement was completely new. And I'm pretty sure, I think all of my secondary questions were also changed as well. The only thing for some of them that stayed the same was like some of the activities. So if I had some activities like that I had on my first application cycle, like some of the descriptions were similar, but if I wanted to adjust like takeaways, and I kind of had updated those as well.
And then what about the number of schools you applied to, or which schools you applied to? Did that change at all?
Yeah, I can start off with this one. The first time around, I applied to about like 20 schools, which is I think Austin Simmery had mentioned. The second time around, I definitely wanted to make sure I casted like a wider net. So I applied to like 50 schools, which again, I don't know if I would recommend, because like when the rolling secondaries came in, it was like really difficult to keep up with them. And then also it was just like a lot of money and just following up, it just like got exhausting. So I think maybe like from folks I've heard, like a happy medium would be like around 30 schools. But I think again, it's just like very dependent on your situation. But I would recommend just like looking closely at mission statements, and then also like being really critical by looking at like the MSAR, and seeing like where you fall in terms of just like your GPA and your MCAT and like your metrics, to see if you're an actually like competitive applicant or if it's like a reach school for you, and just being honest about that when you're like making a decision to apply to schools. And I also like made just like a Excel sheet where I kept track of like all the schools I applied to, when their deadlines were, when I submitted, when I heard back, like interviews and all that. And I found that really helpful to just keep track of everything too.
Yeah, I recommend for any reapplicant, like definitely broaden, apply to more schools than you originally intended to. It's one of those things, like you don't have to, always fill out a secondary if you don't want to. You obviously don't have to go to interviews if you're kind of overwhelmed because you get so many. That's wonderful. You always miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. At the same time, looking at, I think Gurjeet just has like awesome recommendations, looking at MSAR and looking at mission statements to see if you really fit with that school. For those of you looking to apply to regional areas, I also think it's worth it to, look at applying to a region that, you might be interested in living, or that you have friends in that really like to live there as well. I think when it comes to making a medical school class, they like to build classes of people that come from kind of like all over the country. So maybe you might not have considered living in, Florida or like the Pacific Northwest at first. But if you could see yourself at that school, it's no reason that you shouldn't apply there, and, maybe look at it as like more of a serious choice for your medical school.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think you kind of have to do, like Gurjeet said, just look at the numbers, because the first step is, ask yourself, are my like MCAT score and GPA gonna keep the door open, or maybe close the door? And I think one of the most obvious lessons I learned from the first time around is, you really, it's not always worth it to just say, well, maybe I'll just put an application out there and see what happens. I think the second time I was much more intentional about which schools I applied to, the type of school I applied to, the metrics associated with that school, and the mission statement also, and how that aligned with what previous experience I had, and what sort of goals I wanted to achieve at the school. And that takes some serious preparation and a lot of planning and research before everything else, or on top of everything else. But I think that step actually is one of the most valuable of making your list in a realistic way.
Thank you. So we have a question in the Q&A that's related to this topic. So the question is, when crafting your school list the second time, did you include the majority of schools you had previously applied to, or did you try to avoid those and only apply to schools that would not have your previous app?
I can start with that one. I think it's very important to also include schools that were not on your previous application. There are some programs, at least from what I remember when I was applying, that would openly tell you if you applied a certain number of times to that program that your application would not be considered past whatever that number was. There are some programs that do keep files of previous applications, and don't necessarily look favorably on a reapplicant. So when you're crafting your list, you should definitely include some schools that you haven't applied to before. However, it does not mean that every program does this. It does not mean that every program, is not favorable towards reapplicants, anything like that. Some programs are a little bit more forthcoming in what they do with it, and some are not as forthcoming. And to account for that uncertainty, I think it's really important to include some, some fresh programs on your list as well.
Yeah, I'd echo what Emily said, to include programs you haven't applied to. And in terms of just figuring out if you want to reapply to some that didn't work out the first time, I just like looked at the mission statements and I was like, is this a school that I would really want to go to? And am I like now competitive enough to like apply there? And if I was, then I decided to like go ahead and reapply. But like Emily said too, make sure you look on MSAR or like their website to see if they have a limit on how many times you can apply to schools, because some had like 2, others had like 3, and some. And then also I think on the MSAR, like you can have a breakdown of like the demographics of like the accepted applicants, and it'll even show you like how many students came from post-bac programs or how many students had reapplied. So like even if schools weren't outright about like if they looked favorably or not, like I would look at that to figure out like, okay, they accepted reapplicants, so like I could have a chance here too. So those are like some of the factors that I looked at and thought about when I was figuring out which schools I would want to reapply to again.
Yeah, and if I'm recalling correctly, I think it was either in the primary or secondary, there are questions about like, oh, are you a reapplicant? And if you are, you know, what things have you done since the last application? And I think that's a really great place to highlight all the great things you've done since then, right? Yeah, so we have a couple other questions in the Q&A. Really quickly, did any of you apply to Texas schools without being a resident there? I'm getting no from everyone. Okay, so sorry, we don't have much information about that. And then the last question that we have for now is, how do you improve interview skills?
I can start with this one. I think the number one way is just practice. And I think it's almost similar to the kind of feedback about the essays. You know, if you can practice with different people on different topics, I think you'll be like more ready for anything. And you can also do a little bit of research depending on the school you're interviewing at. So some schools have the MMI format, some have just the one conversation for an hour with one person. So it's good to practice both. I think you can also, there are lists of hundreds and hundreds of interview questions online. You don't necessarily have to do every single one of them because they can get a little bit similar. But I would say, if you are able and have people who are willing, you can just say like, give me, here's a list of questions, just ask me and we can go through it together. And that's mainly what I did. I did practice questions. I also rehearsed answers, saying them out loud, because it's one thing to have kind of bullet points or talking points for each answer or each question, but it's a whole nother thing to say them out loud. And the more you can verbalize your thoughts, the more comfortable you'll be when you kind of get in the actual game time interview at the school.
Yeah, I'd echo what Austin said, practice as much as you can. And if you're not able to like actually practice with people, you can try to like record yourself to like just see like mannerisms and stuff. And I like that's how I found out I talk a lot with my hands. And so I was like, okay, like maybe I need to like work on that a little bit and stuff. And then I also was able to like find just like there's like a bunch of great organizations that hold like practice like mock MMIs, like it's like through me mentor and stuff like that. So like I attended some of those and it was great to get feedback from different people there too. So I think, and then like what Austin said, just have an idea of like how you would want to answer questions. So like I Googled different like, questions that might come up and stuff. And I didn't necessarily like rehearse it word by word, but I had like a couple of bullet points where I'm like, okay, this is like an activity I'd want to mention for this. This is like an experience I'd want to talk about. And then like I would just practice talking about it to a point where I just felt comfortable bringing up like key points. And it just made like the world of a difference like the second time around when I was interviewing, and I could clearly tell when I was there during the day too. So because the first time I did not practice like at all, and the second time around I did, and you just feel a lot more comfortable as well.
Echo both of those. I think my big tip for interviewing is when you're practicing those bullet points, prior to your interviews, you can always practice telling like between 3 and 5 stories around those bullet points. I rehearsed them like ad nauseum with my friends, and by the time I got to an interview, not only was like when I would have an MMI question that I'd want to talk about one of those stories in, I would also have rehearsed the story. And so I knew I wasn't, going too long and kind of dragging on and using up my interview time just to get out the point of the story. But I also felt very comfortable and like almost like it was second nature. And then for MMIs too, when you get your situation, if you have MMI interviews, you can always think of like 3 points that you want to make when you're answering that question when you actually go into the room. And those were just 2 strategies that I felt were really key in like not only like me feeling comfortable with the interview, getting through the interview, but also being really successful in the interview and feeling like it was like a meaningful interaction I would have with my interviewers.
Yeah, all great advice. Okay, so more questions in the chat. This is great. Keep the questions coming. In terms of like certain essay topics, like the adversity or challenge essay, or even your personal statement, like answering why medicine, what is your advice about talking about self-reflection and reapplication and things like that in those types of essays?
I can start with this one. I think, this reapplication cycle is definitely an option, but also consider what sort of opportunities you have for personal growth. So what did you write about last time? Has anything changed since then? And think you can even hold them side by side and say which one do you think is stronger? But I personally did not write about my reapplication. I talked about it in interviews sometimes, but I wrote about something else, like the job I had gotten in my gap years. So I think it's up to you. If it's the thing you think captures a moment where you were faced with a challenge and you like grew and overcame that challenge, that's definitely a good thing to write about.
Yeah, I think it's definitely personal. I didn't talk about it in my personal statement just because I think like Brandon mentioned it, like some of the secondary questions like they ask you, like were you a reapplicant, like what have you changed since then? So I thought that would be like a good point. And I personally didn't think like my why medicine was like really tied in with like just reapplying to med school. I wanted to talk about other parts of my story. And during like interviews, I feel like some of the schools did ask me, so I had the chance to talk about it then as well. So I think it just depends on like the type of like picture you want AdCom to like get of you and like your entire, like I know some, like one of my mentors was telling me like you want to think of your whole application kind of as like a moment to brand yourself, which is kind of weird, but like what message do you want? Like what 3 words would you want like the AdCom to think of after they read your application? And like reapplicant wasn't one of them for me. So I had other words that I wanted them to get across. And so that's why I focused my personal statement application more so on that.
Completely agree. I think it's always hard because it's definitely something that is often in the forefront of your mind. Like, I've been through this before, they're going to know I'm a reapplicant. And that's not necessarily the case unless they ask you outright and you answer that question. It's You can very much talk about it if you want to. And if they don't ask you for it, you don't have to have it as part of your adversity challenge question if you don't want to. And I think oftentimes it's not because people will put in other facets of their life. Kind of going back to something I said earlier, but I think it's awesome, like what Gurjeet said, like start small and just think about like the words that you want people to walk away from, and then maybe like broadening that to a sentence. And then if you like those things and kind of those descriptive qualities about yourself and you want to write about them, then that's the time to turn it into paragraph format. And I think kind of sticking around the idea of ideas is something that can be really helpful. So you don't feel like you're getting bogged down in something that you don't want to be talking about or something that you don't necessarily want your readers to walk away from your application thinking.
Thanks, everyone. So we're running out of time. We still have a few more questions. So for these next questions, maybe if only one person wants to answer them, if you feel strongly about them. Okay, so in terms of your personal statement, how did you know where exactly to start redrafting a new statement if you are really attached to your first one?
Yeah, I can answer that one. If you are really attached to your personal statement and if you completely put that statement out of your mind and you write down why medicine, and it's basically all of the same points that you were talking about in your first personal statement. I think in those cases, especially if you've put it in front of different people and they've come back to you and said this is an awesome personal statement, it's perfectly okay to stick to that personal statement and the parts of it that you like. If you can redraft whatever you feel like is necessary if you want to include some more things that you worked on in your year of reapplying or something like that. And if you really feel like your personal statement was one of those kind of sticking points in your application and you're looking to redraft, I'd kind of go back to what we said earlier and maybe think about different words that you want your readers to walk away from thinking about your personal statement. Starting small and then building up can really be helpful. You can think about some of those meaningful stories that you have throughout your career that led you to medicine, seeing if those work. But I don't think that you need to completely redraft your personal statement in every single reapplicant application. And it's really important to keep those parts of your application that you feel like were very strong in the first place. It can really help you, and it might not have been the sticking point the first time around.
Thanks. Okay, second question. In choosing your letter writers, how did you differentiate on who to approach, whether it was an MD or a PI professor or a community member? And again, we'll just have one person answer this.
I can go ahead and try answering this one. A piece of advice that someone gave me, which I thought was really helpful, was when I was trying to think of letters of rec, I kind of just was focusing on my activities, and then so I kind of figured out which would be my most meaningful ones, and I wanted to make sure I had a letter of rec supporting my most meaningful activities, because it's the person was telling me it's kind of an assumption if it's meaningful, you must have formed some meaningful relationships with people there, and that letter of rec can just elucidate more on that activity. And then in terms of just figuring out, should I reach out to this specific doctor, or should I focus on professors, I use the MSAR to see what the specific requirements were from every school. And then on top of that, I just thought about people and activities where I knew if the person was writing a letter of rec, they could add to my application in a way that I couldn't just by myself. So I tried to focus on people who I had longitudinal relationships with, and making sure they could actually talk about me as a person in a way that the person reading the application would be able to be okay, this is something else that I learned about her that I didn't know, or if further, or they further elucidated something that she had already talked about in her application. So just trying to make sure that when you ask for letters of rec, that those people actually really know you well. And it's not just a checkbox, wanting to make sure it's a research person and then a physician and stuff. If they don't really know you well, it'll come across to the person that's reading the application.
Totally agree. Okay, so last question. We're going to end on a positive note. What is one piece of advice you would give to reapplicants? And what is there to look forward to in medical school? What is it like finally being in medical school?
I can start this one off. The piece of advice is I think, the grass is greener where you water it the most. So you really have to put in the time, you have to put in the work. But I think you also have to believe that it'll pay off in the end, in order for it to really come true. And the the medical school, I think it's been a little bit of a weird year for the first years, but I would say number one is the other students, meeting the classmates and being a part of a community that's all working toward a shared goal of really taking care of people in a beneficial and excellent way. I've loved meeting everybody.
Yeah, just to echo what Austin said, in terms of just advice, just be like really resilient and like, I guess just trying to like the reapplication cycle is going to be difficult. Like it's going to test you mentally like more than the first time around and emotionally. So I think just keeping in mind your support system and like reaching out whenever you feel like you should, and just putting in the work and just believing that the work will pay off because it does in the end. And I think just like I just find myself in awe every time, like randomly when we're learning stuff, and I'm like, I just can't believe like a year ago, like I was, trying to be here and I'm here now. And it's just like, I think it's just like awesome being able to just learn about medicine in a way that I haven't before. And then just like the opportunities in med school, even though it's been like Zoom school for us most of the time, like there's been activities where I've been able to interact with patients in person. And I feel like those recharge me to study so much. Like afterwards, I'm just like, I can't wait to like hit the books and like, become the best type of physician I can be. So like that's something that you definitely have to look forward to.
Last little piece of advice. I think going through the reapplication process is something that it takes a lot of work, and you obviously put a lot of work into it, but you also learn a lot about yourself and how you really handle adversity and disappointment. And it is so valuable to know what that feels like when you go into medicine, because oftentimes in medicine, things will come up that you weren't expecting to go a certain way, and they can be very disappointing. I can't wait for all of y'all MS1s and MS2s to get back to school and in the clinical environment. I can tell you, like I've been at UCLA for 5 years in medical school, and now I have to head off to like the next stage of my journey. And medical school is just a really magical place. You learn so much, you go through so much adversity, you go through times that you really struggle, but then it's kind of like a roller coaster where you immediately go up to the top of the hill and you're on cloud nine. At the end of it, you really don't want to leave. And it's something that all of you should keep working towards. It is so worth it. Every day you go to work and you're changing lives.
Thank you so much for all of our amazing and inspiring panelists. We really appreciate you joining us here, and the attendees as well. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. I will end this meeting by saying, there is hope. You can do it. You're all going to do amazing. Our panelists are living, breathing examples of, light being at the end of the tunnel. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night, everyone.